For thousands of years, the people who lived across Africa left behind a history that was almost impossible to reconstruct. They built communities, migrated across deserts, followed rivers, adapted to changing climates, developed new technologies, traded with distant populations, and survived environmental disasters that transformed entire landscapes. But unlike ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, or Mesopotamia, much of Africa's ancient population history was not preserved in written records. And then there was another problem. Africa is one of the most difficult places on Earth to recover ancient DNA because heat and humidity destroy genetic material. For decades, scientists, therefore, had to look at living African populations and work backward, trying to reconstruct thousands of years of history from modern genomes alone. That picture was useful, but incomplete. Modern populations contain layers of ancestry that accumulated long after the earliest people lived. Then ancient DNA technology started recovering genomes from places scientists once considered almost impossible to study. A 7,000-year-old woman from the Green Sahara, a 4,800-year-old man from ancient Egypt, people who lived in southern Africa more than 10,000 years ago, ancient individuals from Cameroon living thousands of years before the Great Bantu expansion. Suddenly, scientists were not guessing what ancient Africans looked like genetically. They were reading the genomes of the ancient people themselves, and the result was extraordinary. The ancient Africans were not one population. They were not one migration. They were not one simple ancestral group waiting to become modern Africans. They were a complex network of populations, some isolated for thousands of years, some traveling across enormous distances, some mixing with outsiders, and some disappearing almost completely while leaving fragments of their DNA inside later generations. The real story of ancient Africa was not hidden because it was simple. It was hidden because it was far more complicated than anyone expected. The first misconception to disappear is the idea that Africa had one genetic origin after the emergence of Homo sapiens. Africa is the birthplace of our species, but that does not mean early humans lived as one unified population. Modern human populations were spreading across an enormous continent, containing deserts, forests, mountains, coastlines, savannas, rivers, and isolated valleys. Different groups could remain separated for very long periods, while others encountered one another repeatedly. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these populations accumulated different genetic histories. That is one of the main reasons Africa contains more human genetic diversity than any other continent. Populations outside Africa descend from relatively small groups that left the continent and carried only part of the diversity already present there. Inside Africa, however, many deeply separated lineages continued developing independently. This means that two African populations can sometimes be genetically more different from each other than populations living on different continents. That fact does not mean Africans belong to different categories of humanity. It means the continent preserved the longest and deepest record of our shared species history. Southern Africa provides perhaps the clearest example of this ancient continuity. At Oakhurst Rock Shelter in South Africa, researchers recovered genome-wide DNA from 9 ancient individuals whose remains span much of the Holocene. The oldest individuals lived roughly 10,000 years ago, while others lived much more recently. The genomes revealed something exceptionally unusual compared with many other regions of the ancient world: long-lasting genetic continuity. For nearly 9,000 years, the population represented at this site did not show the repeated waves of population replacement and large-scale admixture that transformed much of Europe and Asia. Instead, the ancient ancestry remained remarkably stable through most of this period. The people living there changed culturally, adapted to their environments, and developed new technologies. But genetically, they remained closely connected to earlier inhabitants of the same region. Think about how unusual that is. During the same broad period, other parts of the world were being transformed by major migrations. Farming populations were expanding through Europe. Pastoralists moved across the Eurasian steppe. Populations moved through the Iranian plateau and into South Asia. Yet in southernmost Africa, an indigenous population maintained extraordinary genetic continuity across thousands of years. This does not mean these people were frozen in time. They were not living fossils, and they were not biologically unchanged. They continued evolving like every other human population. The discovery simply shows that the people themselves remained the main population living in that landscape, rather than being repeatedly replaced by newcomers. Even more fascinating is what happened when scientists compared the ancient southern African genomes with modern populations. Some modern Khoisan communities preserve ancestry that is directly connected to these ancient populations. Later migrations brought additional ancestry into southern Africa, including ancestry associated with populations that expanded southward from other parts of Africa. But the much older genetic layer did not disappear. It remained visible underneath the newer ancestry. This is one of the biggest lessons ancient DNA has taught scientists. Population history is usually not a clean replacement. An older population can survive, receive ancestry from migrants, and continue into the present while becoming genetically different from its ancient ancestors. That means modern DNA can contain multiple historical layers simultaneously. The 2026 whole genome study of southern African individuals pushed this discovery even further. Researchers analyzed 28 ancient genomes from individuals living between approximately 10,200 and 150 years ago, including several with very high-quality genomic data. The oldest individuals carried genetic profiles that fell outside the range of variation seen in modern populations, including present-day Khoisan groups. Some ancient variants were associated with biological functions, including kidney processes and protection from ultraviolet radiation. The finding demonstrates that evolutionary change continued inside African populations for thousands of years. Africa was not simply the place where humans originated before evolution happened somewhere else. Evolution continued inside Africa, producing local adaptations and genetic changes, while different populations followed their own paths. Now, move thousands of kilometers north into a landscape that seems impossible for large human populations today, the Sahara Desert. Around 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, however, the Sahara was dramatically different. During the African humid period, lakes and river systems appeared across enormous parts of the region, grasslands expanded, and wildlife occupied areas that are now completely dry. Archaeological evidence shows humans living across this green Sahara, hunting, fishing, gathering plants, and eventually keeping livestock. But until recently, scientists had almost no genome-wide DNA from those ancient populations because DNA preservation in the Sahara is extremely difficult. Then researchers recovered genomes from two women who lived approximately 7,000 years ago at Takakori in southwestern Libya. Their DNA revealed a previously unknown North African ancestral lineage that appears to have remained largely isolated for most of its history. The individuals were closely related to ancestry found in much older North African foragers from Tafarelt in Morocco. That meant the people living in the Green Sahara were not simply a new population that had arrived with pastoralism from the Near East. Instead, much of their ancestry was already deeply rooted in North Africa. The spread of pastoralism into the Sahara could therefore have happened largely through cultural diffusion, meaning local people adopted herding practices without being massively replaced by incoming populations. This discovery changes the way we imagine the ancient Sahara. We often picture a green environment and assume that because the landscape was habitable, populations must have mixed freely. But the genomes suggest something more complicated. The Sahara could function as a corridor during some periods and a barrier during others. The same landscape that once allowed humans to move across grasslands eventually became a desert that separated populations. Climate did not just determine where humans could live, it determined which human populations could interact genetically. As the Sahara dried, communities that had previously been connected became increasingly isolated. Ancient DNA is revealing the genetic consequences of that transformation. The Takakori genomes also produced another extraordinary result. Their ancestry was closely connected to ancient North African populations, but showed much less Neanderthal ancestry than typical populations outside Africa. Researchers estimated only about 0.15% Neanderthal ancestry in the Takakori genome examined for archaic segments, much lower than most populations whose ancestors participated in the major out-of-Africa expansion. This tells us that the ancestors of this North African lineage remained connected to African populations for a very long time, rather than simply following the same genetic path as populations that left Africa permanently. The genetic history of North Africa was therefore not merely a bridge between Africa and Eurasia. It contained its own deeply divergent African populations. Travel farther east, and you reach the Nile Valley, where another chapter of ancient African ancestry was finally opened. Egypt has one of the most famous archaeological records on Earth, but ironically, it has been one of the most difficult places for scientists to recover complete ancient human genomes. Heat accelerates DNA degradation, and Egyptian mummification does not automatically preserve usable genetic material. For years, researchers had only fragments. Then scientists recovered a complete genome from the remains of an adult man who lived approximately 4,800 years ago, around the time of Egypt's early pyramid-building era. The genome provided the first full ancient Egyptian human genome sequence and gave researchers a direct look at the population rather than relying only on modern Egyptians or archaeological inference. The man's ancestry was predominantly North African, but researchers detected a significant component associated with populations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent, including regions around ancient Mesopotamia. The result does not mean ancient Egyptians were simply immigrants from the Near East. Quite the opposite. The majority of his ancestry was rooted in North Africa, but the outside component demonstrates that people were moving between northeastern Africa and West Asia long before the height of the Egyptian Empire. Trade and cultural connections between Egypt and the Fertile Crescent were therefore accompanied by human movement as well. This is another pattern that keeps appearing in ancient DNA. Outside ancestry can enter a population without replacing the population. Ancient Egypt retained a strong local genetic foundation while incorporating ancestry from neighboring regions. The same principle applies across Africa. Migration does not automatically mean replacement. Sometimes it means one population adds a small layer to another population that remains largely intact. Now, travel west and south into Central Africa, because here ancient DNA revealed another shocking contradiction to the simple textbook story. The Bantu language family today covers a massive part of sub-Saharan Africa. Hundreds of millions of people speak Bantu languages, stretching from Central Africa into eastern and southern regions. Genetic research has shown that the large-scale Bantu expansion began several thousand years ago in western Central Africa and then spread over a huge area. But the question is simple. Who exactly were the people living in the Bantu homeland before this expansion? The answer from the Shumlaka site in Cameroon was not what scientists expected. Researchers sequenced ancient individuals who lived around 8,000 and 3,000 years ago. Their ancestry was more closely related to ancient West Central African hunter-gatherers than to modern Bantu-speaking populations. In other words, the people living in a region closely associated with the origin of Bantu languages were not themselves the main ancestors of the later Bantu-speaking populations that spread across the continent. A linguistic homeland and a genetic homeland are not always identical. Nature. That discovery changes how we understand the Bantu expansion. It was not simply one population sitting in Cameroon and then spreading unchanged across Africa. Instead, language, technology, people, and ancestry moved through a complicated series of demographic events. Different populations interacted. Some groups expanded, others were absorbed. Some ancient communities disappeared as distinct groups, while leaving ancestry behind. The modern genetic landscape is therefore the result of several populations interacting rather than one population simply replacing everyone. One of the Shumlaka males carried the deeply divergent Y chromosome lineage ACUR0, which is especially important because that lineage is most common today among some populations in western Cameroon. Its presence in an ancient individual demonstrated that this extremely old paternal branch existed in the region thousands of years ago. But again, the Y chromosome is only one line of ancestry. It cannot tell us the entire genetic history of a population. What it provides is a single, powerful thread connecting ancient individuals with living genetic diversity. East Africa reveals yet another model. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, and the Great Lakes became major meeting zones for hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, and farming populations. Pastoralism spread across eastern Africa thousands of years ago, but the genetic evidence suggests that its arrival was not identical everywhere. Some incoming groups mixed substantially with local populations. Others retained more distinct ancestry. Later, farming expansions created additional layers. The result is an East African genetic landscape where ancestry can reflect movements that occurred across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. The Horn of Africa is especially interesting because it sits beside the Red Sea, connecting Africa with Arabia. Genetic studies have found varying degrees of West Eurasian-related ancestry in some Horn populations, while others remain predominantly associated with deep African lineages. This uneven distribution makes sense if migration happened episodically rather than through one enormous population replacement. People moved across the Red Sea at different moments, and their descendants became integrated differently into local communities. North Africa provides another example of how climate and geography shaped genetic history. The ancient green Sahara populations were deeply connected to North African ancestry, but remained surprisingly distinct from sub-Saharan populations. That means North Africa cannot simply be treated as a genetic extension of Europe, the Middle East, or sub-Saharan Africa. It developed its own ancestral structure through long periods of local continuity and selective contact with neighboring populations. Later migrations from the Levant and other parts of Eurasia added additional layers, but they did not erase the older North African foundation. And this is where one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient Africa falls apart. The continent was not divided into neat racial populations that stayed in place from the beginning of human history, nor was it a single population that spread outward and gradually separated into modern ethnic groups. The real picture is much more complicated. Populations were constantly dividing and reconnecting. Some groups migrated long distances, others remained close to their ancestral territories. Climate repeatedly changed the corridors through which humans could move. New technologies allowed populations to expand into new environments. Social structures determined whether outsiders were absorbed or remained separate. Sometimes genetic continuity lasted thousands of years. Sometimes replacement happened rapidly. Sometimes both occurred at the same time. An old population could survive in one area while newcomers became dominant in another. That is why ancient DNA is so powerful. Modern populations tell us who survived. Ancient DNA tells us who existed before the survivors became dominant. This distinction is changing our understanding of African ancestry at an extraordinary speed. For example, modern Bantu-speaking populations are widespread across the continent, but ancient genomes show that different populations existed in the same regions before and during the expansion. Modern southern African communities may carry ancestry from ancient local hunter-gatherers, Bantu-speaking migrants, and later pastoralist populations. Modern North Africans carry deep North African ancestry alongside later Eurasian-related contributions. Modern Egyptians carry a strong local Nile Valley foundation, but also evidence of ancient contact with the Fertile Crescent. There is no contradiction in having all of those layers simultaneously. That is what population history looks like. And perhaps the most important lesson is that ancient Africans were not genetically frozen. The phrase ancient population can create the impression that these people were somehow less evolved or less sophisticated than modern humans. That is not how biology works. Every ancient person was a modern human being. Their populations continued to evolve. Their genes responded to environmental challenges. Their societies changed. Their cultures developed. Their descendants carried some of their adaptations forward. The southern African genomes provide especially strong evidence for this because researchers identified variants involved in biological processes that had developed within regional populations. Evolution did not stop because humans had already emerged. It continued every generation. This also explains why Africa contains so much genetic diversity. The continent has hosted human populations for longer than anywhere else, giving natural selection, genetic drift, mutation, migration, and population separation enormous amounts of time to operate. Outside Africa, populations experienced repeated founder effects as smaller groups migrated away from the continent. Every major expansion carried only a portion of the diversity available in the source population. That is why the genetic diversity of Europe, East Asia, and the Americas is generally lower than the diversity found across Africa. But the most powerful part of this story is that ancient African diversity is not only preserved in archaeological sites, it is still alive. Modern Khoisan populations carry ancestry connected to ancient southern African people. Modern North African populations retain deep ancestry, related to prehistoric North African populations. Modern Bantu-speaking populations carry genetic connections to the populations involved in their ancient expansion. Modern Egyptians preserve a predominantly North African foundation with ancient connections toward West Asia. The ancient populations are therefore not completely lost. They are part of us. Some of them survived almost directly. Others survived through admixture. Others survive only as tiny genetic fragments. And some may have disappeared so completely that scientists can only infer their existence from unusual patterns in modern DNA. These are the ghost populations of human history, people whose bones have not been found, whose languages are unknown, whose names were never written, but whose genes remain hidden somewhere inside later populations. Ancient DNA is beginning to recover those ghosts. And this is why the ancient African story is changing so quickly. Every new genome has the possibility of revealing an entire population that scientists did not know existed. A single skeleton can change the model. A single ancient lineage can reveal a migration. A single genetic connection can overturn a theory that survived for decades. The people of ancient Africa were not simply waiting to become the populations we see today. They had their own histories. They had their own migrations. They had their own genetic identities. Some stayed, some moved, some mixed, some vanished, and some left their genetic fingerprints inside people alive today. That is the real meaning behind the title. The ancient Africans were never who we thought because the old story was too simple. There was no single ancient African population. There was a continent full of populations living different lives at different times. The Green Sahara reveals one. Ancient Egypt reveals another. Shumlaka reveals another. Oakhurst reveals another. And beneath all of them lies an even deeper truth. Africa was the stage on which most of human evolution unfolded. Every modern human outside Africa carries only part of that ancient history. But the greatest concentration of human genetic diversity remains inside the continent itself. So when scientists compare ancient African DNA across regions, they are not merely reconstructing the ancestry of Africans, they are reconstructing the deepest chapters of the human story. And those chapters are more complicated, more interconnected, and far more extraordinary than the simplified version most of us were taught. The ancient people are not speaking through monuments. They are speaking through genomes, and now after thousands of years, scientists are finally learning how to listen.